Hello, everyone, and welcome back to War and Literature, English 1120 at the University of Ottawa. I'm Tim Wilson. Tonight's lecture is the second of 4 lectures on Shakespeare's Henry V. Tonight, we're going to talk about what could be called the skeptical interpretation of the play, the interpretation of the play that calls into question whether or not Shakespeare is really trying to celebrate the achievements of Henry V and points to the fact that he may in fact have been subtly critiquing the achievements of Henry V as well as the glory of war and what have you. So without further ado, let's get started, and we'll start with this PowerPoint presentation to guide the discussion. So we'll be talking about this skeptical interpretation. Our visual here is a drawing of the scene that's described to us. We're not shown this, but the death of Falstaff, and we'll talk about that. And that death is described in Act 2, Scene 3. So as I mentioned last time, for the first few hundred years of the play's performance history and interpretive history, up until the beginning of the 20th century, it had been taken for granted that the play is a celebration of the English cause in the 100 Years' War, a celebration of their triumph at the Battle of Agincourt, a celebration of the greatness of Henry V. Then in 1919, Gerald Gould offered the first real skeptical reading of the play, and he was a soldier returning from World War I, and he asserts that the play's ironic. And I think it's interesting that you can really only, it took someone coming back from a war to really have this new perspective on the play. So for Gould, it's a satire rather than a celebration of imperialism and patriotism and the glories of war. And for him, more discerning spectators are supposed to see the anti-patriotic messages there that are being kind of smuggled in along with the patriotic messages. So back to that image of the duck that's also a rabbit that was used by Rabkin later. For Gould, we could say all along we've been seeing Henry and the play as a celebration of war, as a rabbit, let's say, but in point of fact, actually, it's a critique of these things. It's a duck. So one of the first scenes and factors that Gould will point to, as well as others after Gould that are continuing this line of what I would call the skeptical interpretation of the play, is the very first scene after the chorus. So what we could call the machinations of the church in Act 1, Scene 1. And what we see here is we're shown right off the bat that the real reasons for the war are not patriotic, but it's backroom politics. And what we hear from 2 bishops that are discussing this issue right off the bat here is that Parliament is proposing a new law that would seize half the possessions of the church. And obviously these bishops are afraid of losing that wealth and power. These archbishops of Canterbury and Ely are looking for a way to avoid it by distracting Henry. And their way to distract him would be to support him in thoughts of war in France. So one note here is that the scene refers to this extreme wealth and earthly power that the church had at that time, the Roman Catholic Church in the 15th century, early 15th century, and preceding that. And the scene points ahead to measures that would be taken by Henry VIII a century later, and just before Shakespeare was writing in the 16th century, to seize the lands of the church and thereby curtail their power, strengthen the power of a centralized monarchy and state power. So the scene contains one of the only references to Parliament in Shakespeare. It refers to this bill in Commons. And just this is a good opportunity to remind ourselves that Shakespeare's views of politics are always personal. So a regime is good, or is as good as the quality of the individual. And there's some discussion of institutions in the Roman plays, because this is what gives them strength. But what we see, especially in the English histories, are that with monarchy, with empire, the quality of a community, the quality of the regime is only as good as the individual leader. So I'd like to turn to a few of the lines here, and we can start to see some of this machination. So some of the lines in Act 1, Scene 1 from these bishops discussing this bill, and they're discussing at this point Henry V and what they can expect from Henry V, and whether Henry would be on their side. The courses of his youth promised it not. The breath no sooner left his father's body, but that his wildness mortified in him seemed to die too. So recall in Henry IV, part 1 and 2, Henry as a boy, Hal, he's not yet ascended to the throne. It has led this riotous youth. He's hanging out with Falstaff and these thieves and drunks in Eastcheap, and he's this real model of the prodigal son, and a disappointment to his father and the royal court in general. Here, the bishops have pointed out that he has had a miraculous change, so to speak, and now he's living up to the promise that seemed to have been wasted in him. Yea, at that very moment, consideration like an angel came and whipped the offending Adam out of him, leaving his body as a paradise to envelop and contain celestial spirits. Never was such a sudden scholar made. Never came reformation in a flood with such a heady current scouring faults, nor never hydra-headed willfulness so soon did lose his seat, and all at once as in this king. Bishop Eli replies, we are blessed in the change. Hear him but reason in divinity, and all admiring with an inward wish, you would desire the king were made a prelate. Hear him debate of commonwealth affairs, you would say it hath been all in all his study. List his discourse of war, and you shall hear a fearful battle rendered you in music. Turn him to any cause of policy, the Gordian knot of it he will unloose, familiar as his garter. That, when he speaks, the air a chartered libertine is still, and the mute wonder lurketh in men's ears, to steal his sweet and honeyed sentences, so that the art and practic part of life must be the mistress to this theoric, which is a wonder how his grace should glean it, since his addiction was to courses vain, his companies unlettered, rude and shallow, his hours filled up with riot, banquets, sports, and never noted in him any study, any retirement, any sequestration from open haunts and popularity. So the Bishop of Canterbury is saying it's almost a miracle how he was able to turn over this new leaf as soon as his father, Henry IV, died, and become this person who, without seemingly taking the time to study these things, he was able to discourse on theological matters like a prelate. He was able to discourse on political matters like a seasoned policy advisor. He's able to discourse on war. And as we'll see throughout this play, it's definitely war that stands out in terms of what he's able to articulate most clearly. So one point I'll say is Nietzsche later on called for these great heroes that would be like a Roman Caesar with Christ's soul, that would combine these two kind of competing worldviews or sets of virtues that we talked about as being at tension in the history plays in the first lecture. And in a way, Henry V, as presented by Shakespeare, does that. He combines the ability to discourse on war with his ability to discourse on theology. And he's able to potentially transcend the tragic conflict that we talked about in the first lecture. So a little bit later in this first scene, again, we'll pick up the dialogue of these two bishops. But my good lord, how now for mitigation of this bill urged by the Commons? Doth his majesty incline to it or no? So they get to the point of, okay, do you think the king will support this bill? Are we in trouble if the king does? And the Bishop of Canterbury replies, he seems indifferent, or rather swaying more upon our part than cherishing the exhibitors against us. For I have made an offer to his majesty upon our spiritual convocation, and in regard of causes now in hand, which I have opened to his grace at large, as touching upon France, to give a greater sum than ever at one time the clergy yet did to his predecessors part withal. So a couple things to note there. Henry seems to be playing them off, right? He's dissembling. He's not making it clear which side he's going to go on, so he can use their incertitude to his advantage. It's very, you could say this is part of his Machiavellian, in a negative sense, maneuver, that his ability to play these other political pawns as pieces in a game. He's playing the clergy to some extent in order to get out of them this large donation. So they, Canterbury saying that they're giving a large donation and convincing him that he should go to war. And the reason they want him to go to war is to divert attention away from this bill that would take their lands. So in the second scene of the play, there's this two scenes within this scene. The first one with the Bishop of Canterbury describing the justification for the war and this discourse on Salic law that we'll talk about. And then in the second part, the ambassador from France gives the message from the Dauphin, which is an insult. And he opens this chest, which is a gift to Henry V, but it's a chest of tennis balls that is mocking him for being a youth and merely kind of frivolous and playful. And Henry V's response to that is he'll return those tennis balls as gunstones on the court of France. So in the first part, in this Act 1, Scene 2, it's set up by, again, Henry V's kind of Machiavellian maneuver. He says he doesn't want to take responsibility for the declaration of war. He wants to put the responsibility clearly on the cardinal. If first of all, say, it's you have to tell me whether or not I can go to war in France. So it's up to you to interpret the laws. Your interpretation will determine whether or not we go to war in France. So the ultimate decision is resting in a sense on the cardinal, not the king. And then later he puts the responsibility for causing this war on the Dauphin for that insult. And he says, okay, well, we'll reply to this insult by going to war. So Henry's forcing, in the first part there, the cardinal, the archbishop to interpret the Salic law code in such a way that it does not apply to France. So the archbishop, so let me back up. So this Salic law had declared that no female could ascend the throne in France. So it was ostensibly around since the time of Clovis, the king of the Franks. And for that reason, you have kings in France exclusively, and in England you have several female monarchs. So it also meant that you can't trace your lineage through a female according to the Salic law. Now, Henry V's claim to particular areas of France was his claim through a female within the line. So he had to somehow get around this question of Salic law. And the result is that the Archbishop of Canterbury interprets this Salic law as not applying to France, even though it's ostensibly a French law. So Canterbury gives this long, convoluted argument that and it's often in performance, it's played comically because it's so long and convoluted, no one understands what's going on. And then he concludes by saying, you know, and this often gets a laugh, this line, as clear as is the summer's sun, this is our claim to this throne. So Henry's response is he doesn't either doesn't understand or he pretends not to understand. He wants to make it very clear that the whole responsibility of the war rests upon the Archbishop. So after Canterbury's explanations, he reiterates his original question: may I with right and conscience make this claim? And the Archbishop answers, the sin upon my head, dread sovereign, for in the book of Numbers it writ, when the son dies, let the inheritance descend unto the daughter. So all of this genealogical analysis that had preceded this question is not clear enough. But what is the ultimate, let's say, answer to the question is, let's say, biblical authority in this instance. So right in the first two scenes, we see questions about the justification of war. It seems like it's all backroom politics, not some sort of glorious cause. Another scene that the skeptical interpreters will point to is Act 2, Scene 3. So in Act 2, Scene 3, we have the reference to the death of Falstaff. And this was another source beginning right from Gould in 1919 of a sense of the irony that undercuts the play. So it, on the face of it, we're supposed to celebrate achievements of Henry V, but there's this subtle undercurrent of what's being silenced in this. You know, the Falstaff that was such a popular character, the most popular character in Elizabethan theater in part 1 and part 2 of Henry IV. And in the second part of Henry IV, Shakespeare at the end, he promises to bring back Falstaff. So he's such a big hit, right? You know, you have to bring him back in another sequel. But it's a promise he fails to deliver. We don't see Falstaff in the play. He's only referred to in passing. And Falstaff he's off stage and he dies, and there's a sense that he dies because of the rejection he received from Hal in the second part of Henry IV. So after Falstaff's boy reports that his master is very sick, the hostess declares that the king has killed his heart. This is Act 2, Scene 1. And then Nym concurs in saying that Henry's rejection turned Falstaff melancholy. He says, the king hath run bad humors on the night. So I alluded to the notion that we could see in this maybe a parallel to the death of Socrates. So I want to remind ourselves of the death of Socrates as portrayed in this Platonic dialogue called the Phaedo. So the Phaedo, well, the apology for Socrates presents Socrates' defense speech. He's on trial and the community's there, and his defense speech to the jury. He's on trial for bringing in strange gods to the city, for corrupting the youth through his questioning of the standards of the community. So the apology presents that defense speech. He's found guilty and sentenced to death. The Phaedo represents this dialogue that takes place in prison as he awaits his death sentence. He gets finally towards the end of that dialogue, he takes the drink of hemlock in a famous scene as presented here visually much later in the 18th century by Jacques-Louis David. This Death of Socrates, I've always really loved this painting. So in the Phaedo, we get this description of the death of Socrates. He's just drunk the hemlock. The prison guard who's administered this hemlock is checking Falstaff, and this poison is slowly working on him. The man who gave him the poison now and then looked at his feet and legs, and after a while he pressed his foot hard and asked him if he could feel, and he said no, and then his leg, and so upwards and upwards, and showed us that he was cold and stiff. And he felt them himself and said, When the poison reaches the heart, that will be the end. He was beginning to grow cold about the groin when he uncovered his face, for he had covered himself up, and said, they were his last words. He said, Crito, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Will you remember to pay the debt? So these are the last words of Socrates, and he has this poison that's taking effect, and part of the effect is this growing numbness that goes up and up his leg, up to his groin. Now compare this with the hostess reporting the death of Falstaff in Act 2, Scene 3. Nay, sure he's not in hell. He's in Arthur's bosom. If ever man went to Arthur's bosom. So this is kind of a little joke because she's mixing up Arthur with Abraham. She should have said in Abraham's bosom. So she's mixing up, let us say, like a pagan secular reference to King Arthur, to obviously a biblical and religious reference to Abraham. He made a finer end and went away, and it had been any christened child. He parted even just between 12 and 1, even at the turning of the tide. For after I saw him fumble with the sheets and play with flowers and smile upon his finger's end, I knew there was but one way, for his nose was as sharp as a pen, and he talked of green fields. How now, Sir John, quoth I, what man be a good cheer? So he cried out, God, 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 3 or 4 times. Now I, to comfort him, bid him he should not think of God. I hoped there was no need to trouble himself with any such thoughts yet. So he bade me lay more clothes on his feet. I put my hand into the bed and felt them, and they were as cold as any stone. Then I felt to his knees, and so upward, and all was as cold as any stone. So again, we have a very parallel scene with her feeling up his leg, and they're cold and numb, just like Socrates' legs. Here played with more of a sly reference to an almost sexual act on part of the mistress. The other thing I'd point out is that the mistress quickly wants to divert his attention away from God. He's on his deathbed here, and she can tell this, and he's crying out to God. Now, and if anything, I guess you'd want to comfort the person and allow them to have their last confession, their last connection with the divinity, whatever one regards that to be, as they have their fleeting moments on this earth. She wants to kind of stop that, and it's not necessarily the best approach at a person's deathbed, so to speak. So the other thing I'll point to is the Falstaff's fumbling with the sheets and played with flowers and smiled as if he had things at his fingers, but he's picking these flowers that are on the sheets, or at least in his mind, and picking them up and holding them in his hand. And a case has been made that this is kind of an advanced onset of kind of alcohol-induced or alcoholism-induced delusions, and that the whole scene seems to describe what could happen in advanced death of an alcoholic. So we have this scene of Falstaff being compared loosely to the death of Socrates. So why does Shakespeare want us to make this connection? I'll point out that Falstaff's resemblance to Socrates was alluded to in the earlier plays. So Harry calls him, quote, that villainous, abominable misleader of youth, that old white-bearded Satan. And we recall that the charges brought against Socrates at his trial in the Apology are corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods that the city believes in. So we could say that both Falstaff and Socrates are threats to the political regime to a certain degree. That's why Socrates ends up being executed. Hal needed to learn from Falstaff, but there's no room for him in the political order, we could say. And the play seems to say that Henry V as a character is the closest thing we can imagine to the philosopher ruler, or at least the ruler educated by the philosopher. But perhaps this is a satire of the philosopher as such. The better educator of the political ruler is the poet. So maybe Shakespeare is continuing, we could say, in this what Plato had called this old quarrel of philosophy and poetry. He calls it that in Book 10 of the Republic, where which is the best source for educating the community and educating its leaders. Plato saying it's not the poets, it's not Homer, and Greek society had followed Homer, and it had been the Homer and the poets that had educated the community and its leaders. Plato saying it should be educated through rational thought and deliberation of the philosopher. Shakespeare, in a way, could be saying that, kind of a repost, the response of on the poet's part to this quarrel of philosophy and poetry, kind of a counter argument to Plato there. We could say that Falstaff in Henry V represents the dangerous tendency to question assumptions, as does Socrates. And it's a tendency that society must forego if it's united in war, if it's to be united in war. So the philosophic capacity of questioning is exactly the type of faculty that needs to be suppressed in order to forge a myth around English rights in France, Salic laws, tennis balls, all that Henry's trying to forge into reasons for the whole country to get together and to go to war in France. Now, the next scene I want to point to is this ultimatum to Harfleur. This is in Act 3, Scene 3. The English, historically, and what we see in the play is the English invasion force landed at a beach a few miles west of Harfleur, and they began the siege on the August 18th, and the town surrendered on September 22nd. In the interim, the troops were so here's Harfleur here. The troops had been laying siege here, trying to live off some seafood they were getting on the shores here. Turned out they were, living somewhat malnourished. They were getting dysentery from this seafood. Maybe it's not the best stuff, and so their numbers are dwindling. Morale's low. Their numbers. The numbers that are effective are suffering from dysentery, what have you. For the rest of this march that they're going to go on to until the Battle of Agincourt here. So in this speech, what we see in Henry V, the play from Shakespeare, is Henry's cruelty in this ultimatum, the cruel treatment that he's threatening to exhibit on the townspeople if they do not surrender is often cited as another reason we should be critical him of or see Henry V in a critical light. So here's a depiction of the scene as it probably was staged. Remember, we've got that upper stage here that is often used as a balcony, as I mentioned in the Romeo and Juliet famous scene. Here, also used as part of the wall. So the governor and the men of Harfleur will be here, and Henry V is giving the speech we'll see down below. Now, I'll just mention that Olivier, so we have a couple of film versions that, were, let's say, somewhat popular film versions. First, in the 40s, Sir Laurence Olivier's film version was largely in the tradition of seeing this as a celebration of the English cause, almost war propaganda. Kenneth Branagh in '89, I believe, Kenneth Branagh did another film version that was less rah-rah about the war. I think it's somewhat questioning of it. You see, there's a side, you can see Henry as being celebrated in the play to some extent, but there's definitely the dirty underside of the victories also portrayed. So for this speech, in order for Henry to come off as such a hero, Olivier had to cut this whole speech in that movie. A couple of things there. I think a powerful speech, obviously, and obviously really well delivered there by Kenneth Branagh, a great Shakespearean actor and director, of course. Now, this speech, in terms of the threats that are given to Harfleur, as I said, can be interpreted as part of this skeptical interpretation that we're supposed to see Henry V as somehow limited and flawed. You can see that a lot of that could be in the performance. So at the end, you can see this relief that Kenneth Branagh portrayed when he hears the reply from the governor that they're not going to try to defend themselves. So Henry will not need to make good on those threats. He'll be able to spare the town if he so chooses. And you can see that relief that this is the outcome he wanted and was hoping for. And that's one way it can be portrayed, right? And on the other hand, we can say that, well, even if he didn't want that to be the case, the fact that he's willing to have this as an outcome shows the ends to which someone would go, or Henry V would go for a military objective, and that the ends would justify such bloody means. This is very, let's say, ruthless. It's very Machiavellian in a negative sense, one could say. Let's look to the speech first of all, because in the film version, and you'll notice this if you try to compare notes of a film version or even a staged version with the text of Shakespeare, in order to compress it into the time of a movie or a staging, they have to cut out quite a bit. So about half of that speech was actually cut out in the version that we saw from Kenneth Branagh. So let's turn to it and make sure we catch it and are able to piece it together. So here in the first few lines are lines that he does give. How yet resolves the governor of the town? This is the latest parle we will admit. Therefore to our best mercy give yourselves, or like two men proud of destruction, defy us to our worst. For as I am a soldier, a name that in my thoughts becomes me best, if I begin the battery once again, I will not leave the half-achieved Harfleur till in her ashes she lie buried. So I'll just note that for as I am a soldier, a name that in my thoughts becomes me best. So we're going to see Henry is able to play a lot of roles. We already saw in the Henry IV plays, we didn't study in class, but we've talked about them. He's able to play a certain role to become friends with the characters in Eastcheap and get to know them. He can play the role of a theologian. He can play the role of a policy advisor in discourse on political matters. He can talk about war. He can play the role of a soldier. And he says here, a name that in my thoughts becomes me best. It's a statement that none of these things is really his true character, but these are maybe roles he can assume. In the last scene, he's going to assume the role of a lover to court Catherine, the French princess. The gates of mercy, and this part of the speech was all cut. The gates of mercy shall be all shut up, and the fleshed soldier, rough and hard of heart, in liberty of bloody hand, shall range with conscience wide as hell, mowing like grass your fresh fair virgins and your flowering infants. So this is quite the image of the soldier, an image also from Homer's Iliad of two armies moving together and soldiers mowing one another down like scythes through grass. I think we looked at that simile in Homer's Iliad. Here, it's not mowing down other soldiers, though. The soldiers will go in and mow down your fair virgins and your flowering infants like grass. What is it then to me if impious war, arrayed in flames like to the prince of fiends, do with his smirched complexion all fell feats, linked to waste and desolation? So on the impious war, I have a note there. I put a note on this compared to, let's say, the piety of the wars that we see in Virgil's Aeneid. And it's an impious war here, partly because it's a civil war. Harfleur is supposed to be English. Henry deems that town to be English, let's say, property or under English domain. So in a way, it's a civil war, and these civil wars are impious wars. What is it to me when you yourselves are cause, if your pure maidens fall into the hand of hot and forcing violation? What reign can hold licentious wickedness when down the hill he holds his fierce career? We may as bootless spend our vain command upon the enraged soldiers in their spoil as send precepts to the Leviathan to come ashore. Therefore, you men of Harfleur, take pay. This is where Brenna's performance picks up the speech again. Take pity of your town and of your people, whiles yet my soldiers are in my command, whiles yet the cool and temperate wind of grace o'erblows the filthy and contagious clouds of heady murder, spoil, and villainy. If not, why, in a moment, look to see the blind and bloody soldier with foul hand desire the locks of your shrill shrieking daughters, your fathers taken by the silver beards and their most reverent heads dashed to the walls, your naked infants spitted upon pikes, whiles the mad mothers with their howls confused do break the clouds, as did the wives of Jewry at Herod's bloody hunting slaughterment. What say you? Will you yield and this avoid, or guilty in defense be thus destroyed? So I think a couple of things. It begins, I think, in these last lines here to say the last 10 lines to become very graphic, and the language and the nature of the language plays upon it as well. So your shrill shrieking daughters, you can almost hear them in that alliteration of the shrill and shrieking, hear the screams in that language. And your fathers taken by the silver beards, as I point out in the note here, reminiscent of what happens to Priam in book 2 of the Aeneid. So we remember that scene of just pure horror of Priam being killed in front of his wife Hecuba at this altar. Priam also being murdered after he had seen the death of his own son. So in this case, Henry V is placing himself in the position of this Greek sacrilegious destruction of Troy, and it's, in a sense, it's a repetition of that destruction of Troy. And as we know, the Greeks had to pay penance for that for years in terms of their nostoi, their return journeys. Agamemnon killed when he returns, Odysseus for 10 years on journey. And a line that in performance and well, even reading it has always given me chills down my spine has been this, your naked infants spitted upon pikes while the mad mothers with their howls confused to break the clouds. So obviously a horrible image, but also it's the image itself of the infants on the spikes, but also the image of these mad mothers, mad in the sense of being insane with grief. The image of the response to the murder. That's why, let's say in the Aeneid, in depicting the death of Priam, it's not so much the death of Priam or his son, it's the reaction of the loved ones. It's the reaction of Hecuba to Priam being killed right in front of her eyes. And here it's the reaction of the mad mothers to their with confused howls as their young babies are spitted upon pikes. And their reaction here is like the wives of Jewry to the bloody hunting of Herod. So this is Herod trying to, after a prophecy of a Messiah to be born. This is recounted, of course, in the Gospels, and Herod tried to kill or forestall this Messiah by killing infants of Jewry, and here again, Henry V is not portraying himself as being on the right side of this history. He would, let's say, repeat that act of Herod. Now, the last lines I'll also just point to here: "What say you? Will you yield and this avoid, or guilty in defense?" So I think there's a good essay, I think, with that title, an article with that title on what is just in war. So there's just war theory. So beginning in the Middle Ages, and we talked a bit about it with our lecture on modernity, and with a little bit of discussion on the Middle Ages. But there's just war theory in relation to your justification for going to war. So it's justice ad bellum, and then there's justice in bello. So within the war, what are just acts? So seizing a town or laying siege to a town is obviously a just act. It happens in every war, according to this theory. But a town that holds out on defense longer than it should, if it's not, quote unquote, and this is the response of the governor, if it's not defensible and it's just prolonging the suffering on both sides, then according to some authors of these different war treatises, the town is guilty in defense, and is their losses, if they're the enemy soldiers, once they do penetrate the walls and take over the town, if they're pillaged, if they're raped and murdered, the guilt is on them. They're guilty in their prolonging the defense. So part of this speech then could be seen as Henry trying to convince them not to go down that road, and that if he does end up having to do this and get his soldiers to be absolutely ruthless so that they take the town, that this would not be his fault. Again, part of the speech is him putting the responsibility on others. So it's kind of a Machiavellian maneuver in that sense, but it could also be seen as, in a traditional sense, this would be, quote unquote, a just act of war. It seems somewhat unbelievable to us to kind of parse this as a just act of war. But again, I repeat that it's historically, as well as in the literature, sieging cities, towns, and the ultimate fall of these cities after a siege is always the most bloody and horrible in literature, starting with Troy, the myth of what happens to a city once it's been taken over after a long siege. But Harfleur is not Troy. It has these parallels in the speech, but it ends up not being Troy. So first of all, Macmorris in Act 3, Scenes 2 said, "I would have blowed up the town, so Krish saved me," he says. So one thing we could say is it's good to have this type of person in your army for battle. This person is so spirited, but it's decidedly an anti-Christian position. So you could say that Shakespeare saw that the Renaissance return to pagan values in its tension with Christian values was producing this conflict of two competing narratives. And in his treatment of Harfleur, in a way, he affects a good synthesis of it, you could say. He threatens them with the type of destruction that they would have seen in kind of in what we see in pagan literature, in Troy, in the Iliad, and as depicted in the Aeneid. But he also at the end shows mercy. He says to Exeter, after, use mercy to them all. He commands, this is what he commands to Exeter after they've seized the town. And we can, so obviously we can contrast this treatment of the city with the most famous classical example, Troy. The next scene I want to point to is Act 4, Scene 6. So this is the order to kill the prisoners. So we talked about what's just in war, and an act that's definitely not just in war is to kill prisoners. And both historically and in the plays, there's this question around, why did Henry make this order? What kind of justification can there be for it? Now, the first, in a way, we get the order twice. We get it in 4:6 and 4:7. So first in 4:6, we get this report from Exeter on the death of the Duke of York. And then there's an alarm that sounds. Remember, these alarms are drums, trumpets, to indicate that there's a battle off in the near distance. And there's a signal that the French troops are rallying and may try a counterattack. So the English had been winning the battle. It looked like things were in good order, but the French still outnumbering the English, and they've got probably more prisoners than they do soldiers. So if the French regroup and attack, and then the prisoners were to affect a sort of fifth column movement within their own ranks, the English could be in trouble. So Henry gives this order, but hark, what new alarm is this? Is this same? The French have reinforced their scattered men. Then every soldier kill his prisoners, give the word through. So here let's say the reason for it is they're going to lose the battle. Now, I guess, again, according to at the time and still today, this would not be a justifiable reason for killing the prisoners according to the norms, the laws of war. And then in the next scene, we get a report of another war crime, the French attack on the baggage train, and the report of the fact that the boys that are attached to the baggage train, including Falstaff's boy, who had been a character that we had seen and gotten to know and love, were murdered in this attack. So Henry tries to justify the order by, again, so he gets it, in a way, it's trying to give this order again as maybe in a more acceptable light as a retaliatory action for this injustice. And this is akin, I would say, to his, let's say, second justification for going to war in Act 1, Scene 2. Like he had already basically decided in his discussion on Salic law with the cardinal or the archbishop. And then when he gets the insult from the Dauphin, he tries to make that his justification for going to war. So Gower says, this is 4:7, wherefore the king most worthily has caused every soldier to cut his prisoner's throat. So Gower's interpreting this as the order, he's interpreting as a retaliation to the attack on the boys, the killing of the boys and the attack on the baggage train. And this is Henry as well from 4:7. I was not angry since I came to France until this instant. Besides, we'll cut the throats of those we have, and not a man of them that we shall take shall taste our mercy. Go, tell them so. So again, Olivier's film is this celebration of Agincourt, of Henry V. In order for that to work, Olivier decides to cut both of those speeches, both 4:6 and 4:7, the reference to the killing of the prisoners. Branagh only refers to the second one. I think even though he wanted to show the gritty side, I guess there's two ways to look at it. Either he saw that as repetitive, why give this order twice? Or if I want to show the gritty side, but I also want to make Henry somewhat likable, and this is more stirring and likable to see it as a retaliation to seeing the death of the boys. And in Branagh's version, he has Henry V carrying the Falstaff's boy after that scene. So I'm going to stop there. We've talked today in this our second of 4 lectures on Henry V about the skeptical interpretation of the play. So we've looked at a few scenes from the first couple of scenes where we see the backroom politics in Act 1, Scene 1, Act 1, Scene 2, backroom politics that is really at stake in terms of why they declared war. We see the death of Falstaff and how Falstaff is another example of what seems to be left behind if we want to see a celebration of Henry V, and the fact that he's still there. Do adept readers like Gould see that as a critique of Henry V? We looked at the ultimatum to Harfleur in Act 3, Scene 3, and how that's quite a chilling description of the ruthless ends that Henry V seems to be able to, or seems to be willing to go to in order to achieve military objectives. And then the ordering of the killing of the prisoners, and how that is also, say, a strike against Henry if we're to try to see him as a noble leader. In our next lecture, we're going to look at the ways in which the play describe Henry's leadership and the war effort as a way in which the different elements of English society are being brought together, as well as the different nations under a proto-united kingdom. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you later. Thanks.